And we're back, and today marks the 15th anniversary of the passing of Chuck Schuldiner. So here on the show, we're playing his music, and fans from all over the world have been sending in requests and telling me some stories on how they met Chuck. Now, on tonight's tribute show, we have some of Chuck's friends and bandmates on to tell us some of their memories. And right now I have with us Bobby Koelble, who, of course, played guitar on the Symbolic album. Thank you for joining us tonight, Bobby.
Hey. Thanks a lot for having me. It's great to be here.
So, Bobby, when was the first time that you met Chuck?
Well, Chuck and I met back when we were both in high school. We didn't go to the same school, but we had a mutual friend that went to my school. This guy named David Minshew, who's a great vocalist, and he still lives in the Orlando area. He invited me over to his house one time. You know, I was a metalhead. He was a metalhead, you know, and in my school, you know, there weren't a whole lot of metalheads, you know, so I would kind of pass this dude in the hallway, you know, and I'm wearing a Maiden shirt, you know, and he's wearing like a Metallica shirt or whatever, and kind of like nod at this guy. Okay, this guy's cool. So we, you know, we eventually became friends, and he invited me over to his house one day to just bring some records over after school, listen to some music, you know, so I showed up with my armful of albums, you know, to his house, and he also had invited Chuck over that day. You know, I was like, we were both like 15, 16, something like that. So Chuck came walking in with his armful of albums, you know, and we just kind of sat around in David's room and just listened to records and just shot the shit and just talked about metal. And it was really cool. That was the first time that we met and hung out, and I didn't really see him a whole lot after that because, again, we didn't live in the same neighborhood. We went to different schools, but, you know, that was the first time I met him, and that was a good hang, you know. We used to always talk about that day, you know, that we initially met and hung out.
And how did you get the gig with Death that later went on with you recording Symbolic with them?
Well, that was around, 1994, I guess. I wasn't really doing much musically. Well, I mean, I was doing things musically, but I wasn't really involved in metal at that point in time. I hadn't been for a couple of years, but I had a friend that worked at a music store in downtown Orlando, this place called Guitars Plus, and his name is John Sutton, who used to play in a band around here called Pain Principle. And Pain Principle is actually the band that Brian Benson came out of. Brian Benson was one of our touring bass players during the Symbolic tours. Really great guy. And I got a message on these things that we used to have called answering machines that everybody used to have in their living room. And I came home one day and there's a message from John, and John's like, "Bobby, pick up the phone. Bobby, pick up the phone. Bobby, pick up the phone." "Why aren't you home, Bobby?" It just went on for a couple minutes, and he just told me that I really needed to call him and that it was important. So I'm like, okay, crap. So I called John, and John said that, you know, Chuck was in the store today, and that, you know, because he shopped there too and got his guitar set up there by Billy and Doug, and he was looking for a guitar player to join the band and to, you know, do whatever with. And of course I flipped out, you know, got his number and, you know, called him immediately as soon as I could. And Chuck picked up the phone. He's like, "Hey, man," and we talked for like 10 seconds. And he's like, "You remember that time at David Minshew's house when we hung out and you brought over the albums and hung out?" And I was like, "Yeah, dude, of course." And it was cool. I hadn't talked to him in many years, and it was almost like, you know, it was, you know, the other day, you know, so it was a cool vibe right off the bat. But that's, you know, I send John Sutton a fruitcake and a Christmas card every year because he totally hooked me up and was very instrumental in me getting the gig, and, you know, extremely thankful and lucky for that, of course.
So what was it like working with Chuck, both in the recording atmosphere and touring or doing shows with him in Death?
Excuse me. Well, as far as the recording was concerned, you know, for me, there wasn't a whole lot to that, honestly. You know, we live in Orlando, the Orlando area. You know, Chuck lived in Altamont. I lived in, well, Altamont, actually, at the time. I lived like 2 miles away from his house when I was in the band. And the album was recorded at this legendary studio in Tampa called Morris Sound, which is about, you know, approximately 100 miles away from where we are. So Chuck would actually go over there and you know, spend the week over there. Then he would come home on weekends, and that was the process until the album got done. You know, he would go over there with Gene, and they would track the drums, and he would just go back and forth. But with me, I was only in the studio for one afternoon, just to play my solos on Symbolic. It didn't take very long at all. So we went over there that day, and I went in with Jim Morris, and I would record a solo, and then Chuck would come in and listen to it, and thankfully he liked everything. I hope he liked everything. I hope he wasn't just like, yeah, okay, whatever, I guess I have to live with this. Sure, I had already kind of demoed the solos a little bit on these ancient devices we used to have called 4-track recorders. He gave me the demos of the tunes, and I would record. So he kind of already knew what was coming, more or less. But yeah, he would just come in and he'd be like, "Oh, dude, that's killer." God, that was an expression that he used to use back in the day. God means very good, by the way. God, right now, God. So anyway, it was a very casual day in the studio. I remember the guys from Suffocation were in there recording an album with Scott Burns. And that was it. That one day was my experience in the studio with Chuck, and he was fine, completely laid back. And he was just a normal guy, really was, he was easy to work with, I also, made sure that I had my shit together. I definitely just tried to, know the parts, play them well, just be on the ball, just the way any band leader would want, anybody that they hired to behave. I tried to be that guy. I just tried to have it together. And from my experience, if, you're relatively easyggoing and you have your act together, then hopefully you'll have a gig for a while, so that's just what I tried to do. And he was totally cool, musically speaking, performance-wise, never had a problem. He was always just there to jam and love the music, and it was really easygoing and laid back as far as that's concerned.
And what about like touring and doing shows with them? How was that?
Again, it was cool. It wasn't really, there's these memes going around that you see every now and then, like what my mom thinks I do, or what my fans think I do, and what I really do. You know what I mean? You've seen those, right? Mm-hmm. Well, and it's always like, and then when you see the one that says, "What we actually do," it's a bunch of guys just like sitting around. And these days everybody's online or with their phones in their hands or whatever. But back in the day, it wasn't really terribly exciting, to be honest. Sure, we would have fun and get into a little bit of mischief, but it wasn't anything really legendary. Chuck wasn't really a big drinker, so he didn't really embarrass himself or wake up in the hallway or anything like that. There wasn't a whole lot of that. That was that was more me and Gene. Anyway, he would, again, it was laid back. It was, and geez, at the time in America anyway, 1995, metal was kind of at a lull in the States in 1995, in terms of the general public is concerned, and rock radio and all that, alternative music was really popular, grunge and whatnot. And so it wasn't like extremely, the resurgence that happened, ironically, right around the time that Chuck died, it wasn't, metal just wasn't that popular in the States at the time. So, we were just kind of out there carrying the flag, just trying to, do it for everybody who wanted to come here. And of course there was still like a hardcore underground crowd, but it was just more out there, just, Chuck was really carrying the flag, man. Obviously he was one of the biggest ambassadors for heavy metal I think there's been. And, we were just out there doing it, trying to do the best job we could every night. And yeah, sure, we had, some good times and some funny stories, but, nothing too legendary. It was more just silly, dumb, nerdy kind of stuff, as opposed to real epic, rock and roll debauchery, But he was an easygoing guy. He really was, he was passionate about his music. And, I never really, he kind of had this enigmatic reputation as someone who was difficult to work with, and he really wasn't. He definitely had a couple moments with the label and, management when he felt he wasn't being treated fairly, when he would definitely stand up for himself. But aside from that, he was just a easygoing guy, and it was, we had a great time on the road.
And, you know, when was the last time you saw Chuck prior to his passing? I think I read a story about you guys passing out in a parking lot somewhere.
We didn't pass out in the parking lot, but if we would have been there for much longer, we might have. Thankfully, the place closed. We tripped and fell down. I'll get to that. I was, when could that have been? That was probably like 1999, 2000, maybe, something like that. I was on my way home from somewhere. I think I was up in the town a little north of where I lived at the time, visiting my dad or my sister, I can't remember. And I was on my way home, and there was this rock bar in town that was kind of directly on the way home. And I just thought I'd stop in, have a drink, and came inside, and there's Chuck. And, you know, he was with a couple friends, and this is when he was in remission, the first time that he was really feeling better, and things were very optimistic, and it was looking like he was going to be okay. This was the first time he had been out of the house in a while, apparently. You know, I just walked in and came over and had a beer, and all of a sudden there he was. And it's pretty amazing. You know, again, I hadn't seen him since he had been sick at that point in time. And I think we probably hugged each other like 30 times that night. You know, we just sat there on the corner of the bar at this place called The Station here in Orlando.
Yep, I know it. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah? Yeah, right? It's where all the hair bands used to play. And it was kind of a cool bar. You know, it was all these train cars that were in the infrastructure, you know, and it was, you know, one of the places where, you know, local musicians would hang out for lack of anywhere else to go, really, you know. So we hung out there, and, you know, Chuck, you know, he wasn't a big drinker anyway, but his drinking chops were definitely down at this point in time. So he got hammered pretty easy, and I saw to it to do my responsibility in that department as well. And we ended up getting pretty tore up, and it was just great to see him, man. Like, I mean, it was like, oh, I love you, man. It was a kind of a fest of that nature. And when we were leaving at the end of the night, he was pretty ripped, like I said. And he was also weak just from, you know, going through what he had been going through. And just walking through the parking lot, you know, we were all arm in arm and laughing, and he tripped, and then I tripped, and just eventually just we all went down in this big pile of intoxicated mess, and just we lied there on the ground for what seemed like forever. It was probably just a couple seconds. And then got up, and that was it. Unfortunately, that's the last time I saw him.
Well, at least it was a fond memory.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I'll never forget that, you know, just because, again, you know, he was a guy who just liked to hang out and smile and have fun, you know, and we did plenty of that night, that's for sure.
Well, Bobby, you know, thank you so much for coming on tonight's show, sharing some of your memories with all the fans of Chuck and Death, and I really appreciate your time, and I wish you all the best. Take care.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, and thank you so much for helping to keep Chuck's music and legacy alive. It means a lot.